Welcome to this Dip Dive. Today, we're really going to drill down into the insights from one specific source, excerpts from Russia's war and U.S. foreign policy.
That's right. This is interesting material because it brings us analysis from a former senior British military intelligence officer and commentator. It draws on various clips, interviews, key figures mentioned right there in the text.
Yeah, and our mission here really is just to be your guides through this particular piece of analysis. We want to pull out the most important insights, the different perspectives, the details that are presented, just to give you a direct line into how this source sees these really complex issues.
Mm-hmm. It definitely offers some viewpoints relevant to, recent events and the ongoing challenges in U.S. foreign policy, especially concerning Russia and the conflict.
We'll be looking at specific interactions the source discusses, different viewpoints within the U.S. administration that it outlines, and maybe touch on some of the broader geopolitical points it raises, too.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's dive in. What does this source put right at the front? It talks about a reported interaction involving Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. There's a reference to a clip, I think, where Trump discusses a phone call they had.
Yes, and the source gives some specifics from that clip.
Yeah.
Trump apparently mentioned, they spoke for 2.5 hours. He said something like, some progress has been made, acknowledged it's a terrible situation, talked about the human cost, citing these high casualty numbers like 5,000 young people killed each week.
Okay, but this is where the analysis in the source starts to get quite critical, isn't it? It points immediately to what was seemingly missing from Trump's public comments.
Exactly. Despite earlier talk, from the U.S. side about maybe major sanctions, there was apparently no sign, no suggestion of really pressing Putin, pushing him towards difficult decisions or concessions during that specific call.
So the takeaway from the source, based on that interaction alone, is pretty stark.
Yeah, it's quite blunt, actually. The assessment presented is that, looking just at that, it seems as if the U.S. president is, being played by Vladimir Putin.
Wow. Okay. And does the source back this up? How does it connect this to Putin's side of things?
Well, it looks at Putin's reported comments about the same call.
Yeah.
And the analysis highlights that his words seemed really aimed squarely at his audience back home, in Russia.
What did he say?
He described the conversation as very informative, very frank, and useful. Now, as the source points out, these aren't exactly the most forceful diplomatic terms, maybe.
No.
But they served a purpose for Putin, according to this analysis. It was about signaling to the Russian people, who are his main audience here, that he's still talking to the U.S. president, that he's seen on the world stage as an equal.
So the analysis suggests Putin's strategy here is kind of trying to, manage Trump, keep him engaged, but not acting too strongly.
Essentially, yes. To try and reel in Trump is the phrase used, hoping to deter him from taking more decisive action against Russia or, significantly boosting support for Ukraine. The tactic, as described, involves constantly dangling this hope carrot, the idea of potential negotiation, hoping it slows down stronger Western responses.
That's interesting. But what does the source say about Putin's actual willingness to negotiate or find peace?
Well, this is a really striking part of the source material. It features analysis from Bill Browder, and his assessment, as presented here, is just unequivocal. Putin has no interest in peace.
No interest, full stop.
That's the core finding presented on this. The source explains that Russia's stated conditions for any negotiation are basically designed from the start to be completely unacceptable to Ukraine, which, makes genuine peace talks impossible, at least on Russia's terms.
And this connects to something else mentioned, right? Why Putin seems to avoid meeting face-to-face with President Zelensky.
Exactly.
Okay.
According to the source, again drawing on Browder's insights here, the assessment is, frankly, that Putin is scared of Zelensky.
Scared? That sounds like a really strong claim. Why would the source argue that?
Well, the material suggests that Putin, based on this analysis, isn't actually very strong in unscripted one-on-one situations. He apparently struggles with thinking on his feet. He needs things to be, scripted, rehearsed.
Right.
And knowing Zelensky is quite capable of thinking quickly, articulating effectively. What the fear, according to this source, is that Putin could be backed into a corner, maybe even humiliated, especially with everyone watching. The source even brings up a specific example, planned peace talks in Turkey. Putin apparently announced he was ready. Trump urged Zelensky to go. Zelensky actually went.
And Putin
didn't show up himself, no. Instead, he sent this group, described in the source as just nobodies. And their stated position was, the source calls it absurd, basically demanding Ukraine withdraw from its own internationally recognized land.
So that incident, as the source presents it, Really underlines the analysis that Putin isn't genuinely looking for peace on any terms Ukraine could realistically accept.
Precisely. The source notes that despite, continued pushes sometimes from the U.S. side for a ceasefire, the Kremlin just seems to stonewall. The analysis in this material basically says it should be crystal clear that no ceasefire is coming soon, not under the current conditions.
Yeah.
One commentator quoted feels it's been obvious for ages, stating flatly that Putin hasn't shifted his position even a tiny bit. His goal remains, quote, the total surrender of Ukraine.
Which then brings up another key point the source discusses, especially thinking about Trump's public statements.
Yeah, sure.
His campaign promise, right, to somehow fix the war in one day.
Yes, exactly. The source points out that Trump really put his neck out, making that very specific, very ambitious claim.
Mm-hmm.
And now, with the war just grinding on, well, this situation, according to this material, makes him look kind of stupid. Yeah. The analysis suggests he's probably trying to find some way out, some way to look less foolish. But Putin just isn't giving him any openings. No quick wins, no concessions that would let Trump claim he delivered on that promise.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly, because this source also tries to give a glimpse inside the Trump administration's dynamics on this. It brings in figures like Senator J.D. Vance, Senator Marco Rubio, mentioned Steve Witt too, I think.
Right. And the analysis includes insights from Ambassador Herbst, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. What's interesting, as the source notes, is that while Herbst is described as something of a Trump fan, he also offers criticism here. He suggests that sometimes Trump seems out of his depth on these really complicated issues.
And what does Ambassador Herbst say, according to the source, about people like Senator Vance?
Well, regarding Senator Vance, the source notes his quite significant involvement in geopolitical stuff, which is presented as maybe a bit unusual for a senator. Often that's more the Secretary of State's turf.
Yeah, traditionally.
So the analysis raises this possibility. Is this a deliberate kind of apprenticeship directed by Trump? Trying to expose Vance to these major international issues, maybe grooming him for a future presidential run. And Ambassador Herbst, according to the source, seems to think that's a reasonable way to look at it.
But Herbst also had criticisms, you said, directed within the administration.
Yes, and this is quite pointed in the source material. Criticism aimed at certain unnamed individuals within the administration. These aren't necessarily people in core foreign policy jobs, apparently, but they have dealings in big government departments.
And the criticism is?
They're described in the material as being basically clueless about the threat posed by Russian national security policy, lacking understanding of Russia's aggression in Ukraine and its ambitions beyond Ukraine.
Wow, clueless. That's strong language reported in the source, and the implication is serious.
Critically, yes. According to this analysis, these individuals seem willing, potentially, to just let Putin take control of Ukraine. The source argues that allowing that would be a major geopolitical defeat for the U.S.
Which would reflect badly on the president.
Exactly. It would make Trump look like a truly failed national security president. And the source adds that Trump sort of gets that last part. He understands the political downside for himself.
It's worth noting, though, the source also mentions Vance's own public statements, right? Saying the Russians are demanding too much for a ceasefire.
Yes, it does acknowledge that. Vance effectively recognizing Russia as the core problem there. And it mentions Vance working with Secretary of State Rubio on other things like India-Pakistan, presenting this as, evidence of Vance's growing role in broader security matters.
So based on this source's analysis, it paints a picture of maybe, two camps around the president regarding Ukraine?
That seems to be the breakdown presented, yeah. You've got one group, as we discussed, that does see Russia as a principal adversary, fully gets the danger its actions pose to U.S. interests.
And the other group?
The other group, according to the analysis in this source, seems clueless about that threat, and worryingly appears potentially willing to just concede Ukraine to Putin.
Okay. The source also steps back a bit, touches on the wider geopolitical picture, like China and Russia. It brings in Arizia Litvich from Chatham House here.
Right. And the analysis suggests China is really providing the absolute minimum it can get away with in terms of supporting Putin.
Minimum.
Yeah. President Xi Jinping might make the right noises to keep Putin sort of contented, but the assessment here is that she's actually very careful. He's avoiding any big, comprehensive bilateral deals, keeping Putin at arm's length.
And the reason given in the source for that caution?
It comes down to economics, mainly. China's most important trading partners are in the West, not Russia. So Beijing has absolutely no desire to deliberately annoy the Western powers unnecessarily.
Makes sense.
But what Xi does value, according to the source, is that the war itself redirects attention. It takes political capital away from the West, forces them to focus on Ukraine instead of, well, China.
Which gives China more room to maneuver.
Exactly. More operational space, potentially, in the Asia-Pacific. And, the source suggests, it lets China learn about modern warfare. Russia is basically providing intel on how Western weapons perform, testing new tech in a real conflict.
The source also picks up on China seeming reluctant to make, big-time investments in Russia.
Yeah, that observation is in there. Could be perceived risk, or maybe China just gets what it needs from Russia without having to commit huge amounts of capital. In this view, Russia is mostly seen by China as a useful tool.
A tool for weakening the U.S. and Europe.
That's the implication drawn in the source, yes.
Okay, one last major point the source raises, and it's a pretty big one. It asks this sort of thought-provoking question about the long term for Russia itself, specifically the idea of the Russian Federation collapsing if Putin were to actually face defeat.
It's framed as a bold question, yeah. Presenting it as a scenario that maybe needs consideration. The source does note the war is creating internal pressure in Russia casualties, the strained economy.
It's usually a but.
There is. The source is also very careful to state that a full collapse is nowhere near there right now. It's not seen as imminent.
Okay.
And critically, it introduces another idea, that the narrative itself, the story about Russia potentially collapsing, or the idea that someone even worse than Putin could come next, that this narrative might itself be a kind of Russian information operation.
An information operation? How would that work, according to the source?
The analysis suggests it could be a deliberate tactic designed to scare both Western Europe and the United States into basically hesitating to push too hard for a decisive Russian defeat.
So by raising the specter of chaos or a worse leader, they hope the West will back off from actions that might lead to Putin's fall.
That's the core idea presented in the source, yes. It aims to discourage stronger Western moves that could risk that outcome.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap the main threads this particular source pulled out for us. We started with that analysis of the Trump-Putin interaction, right? The suggestion of maybe a lack of concrete U.S. pressure, and the possibility, according to the material, that the U.S. president was potentially played.
Right, and that was contrasted with Putin's likely domestic messaging. Plus, the source's really clear finding, based on its analysis, that Putin just has no interest in peace on terms Ukraine could accept.
Then we explored the source's take on why Putin avoids meeting Zelensky face-to-face, the consistent stonewalling on ceasefires. And we touched on the commentary about Trump's one-day promise and how the ongoing war looks against that claim.
We also delved into those internal U.S. dynamics mentioned in the source, figures like Senator Vance, Senator Rubio, and that breakdown of roughly two camps with very different views on the Russia threat operating within the administration.
And finally, we covered the broader context the source touched on. China's cautious stance towards Russia and that whole discussion about potential long-term impacts on Russia, but also, crucially, the idea that talk of collapse might be a strategic narrative, an info-op.
Yeah.
So just to emphasize again for you listening, this deep dive was really focused specifically on extracting the insights and perspectives presented in this one source, Russia's war and U.S. foreign policy. It's meant to give you a concentrated window into one specific analysis of these incredibly complex issues.
And as you think about everything we've pulled out from this material, maybe consider those differing perspectives within the U.S. administration that the source described. Those who apparently see the full Russian threat versus those the source portrays as clueless, maybe willing to let Putin have Ukraine.
Yeah, what does that internal division, as analyzed in this source, tell us about the challenges the U.S. faces? Trying to formulate a coherent, long-term strategy towards Russia, no matter who's actually president.
And maybe add to that the source's suggestion about this collapse narrative possibly being a tactic to deter the West. How does that highlight the complexity? It really makes you think about the information war layer running alongside the military and political struggles, doesn't it? Something to mull over.